All right, this is Mr. McMurray. We're back at biochemistry notes. We're talking about organic compounds, and we're going to talk particularly about hydrocarbons today. But we're going to first we're going to talk about inorganic. How are organic and inorganic different? All right, obviously they are spelled a little different. Inorganic and organic. All right, inorganic means not, so basically they're not organic. Okay, and the biggest difference is this. Inorganic, we're going to talk about those first, then we'll come back and do the organic ones. But they do not contain carbon. That's really the bottom line, especially in chemistry. When we talk about organic or not organic, it has to do with whether they contain carbon. Now, that's totally different than if you're talking about organic food. Organic food has to do with whether it has fertilizer and man-made chemicals added and stuff like that. But in chemistry, it's all about carbon. If we're talking about carbon, it's organic. If it doesn't have carbon, it is inorganic. Now, generally speaking, then that means that inorganic are not produced by living things. Okay? Not produced by living things. Organic compounds are almost entirely are products of living things. They've been produced by living things. That's why we talk about carbon-based life forms. Well, that's us. Okay, we're carbon-based. It's all about the carbon. And so we're organic. Inorganic means that there is no carbon involved. All right. Now, relatively speaking, inorganic is fairly simple and not complex. Okay, so if we look at some inorganic compounds, for example, we have HCl, hydrochloric acid. We have a hydrogen and a chlorine, boom, 2 atoms. That's all there is to it. This one is sodium sulfate, sodium, sulfur, and 4 oxygen atoms. That's a total of 6 atoms in that molecule. All right, and a fairly large inorganic molecule. Calcium has 3. There's 1 phosphorus times 2 and 4 times 2. That makes a total of 10. 13 atoms altogether. That's a fairly large inorganic compound. Now, there are some inorganic compounds that get larger than that, but in general, that's pretty good size. Okay, for an inorganic compound, they don't get that big. Organic compounds, on the other hand, may have thousands of atoms in them. Okay, into a molecule that just repeats over and over and over, and they're extremely more complex. Okay, and so because they have been put together by living thing's body, and therefore they can be a lot more complex. It takes a lot more pattern to it. I mean, there's got to be a purpose to it. They can't just randomly come together to make those complex patterns and orders and so forth. And so inorganic chemicals tend to be fairly simple and not that complicated. That's not to say that inorganic compounds are not important to living things. Okay, there are some inorganic compounds that are very important to living things. Over 3/4 of our body is made up of water, H2O. So water is a very important inorganic compound. Okay, it allows things to dissolve. It's a solvent. Okay, it allows things to dissolve, and we'll talk more about that in later chapters, or you've already talked about that somewhat, sorry, in earlier chapters. And in order for things to react with each other, they need to dissolve in water very often. Sometimes we call it the universal solvent, all right? So things that don't dissolve in it may float in it and be carried, like in your blood and stuff like that, red blood cells going and so forth. So water is very important. Okay, and it allows things to hook together and unhook. We'll talk more about that later. It can soak up a lot of heat if it has water in it. We can go outside and we don't just heat up in the sun because water keeps our body from heating up very quickly. All right, so there are some important. That's a very important. Oxygen is very important. Okay, number 1 question: why do we need oxygen? Guaranteed to see that on a quiz, test, probably both. Why do we need oxygen? Oxygen is necessary to burn things or oxidize things. If we have a candle, we put a jar over it, it will go out eventually. Why? Because it uses up the oxygen. It can't burn anymore. Same thing is true of you. You cannot burn your food unless your cells have oxygen. So when you suffocate someone, what you're really doing is causing their brain cells to not get enough oxygen. And since the brain cells don't get enough oxygen, they can't burn food, they can't burn glucose, they basically starve. Okay, and that's one reason you pass out. Well, the first thing that happens when you suffocate is you pass out because your brain doesn't get enough oxygen. All right, and the last one is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, someone says that's not important to us, we just breathe it out and get rid of it. But actually carbon dioxide is important because carbon dioxide is where all the carbon in living things comes from. Okay, So I said, well, I don't eat, I give off carbon dioxide. How do I get carbon from carbon dioxide? Well, plants take carbon dioxide, add water to it, and make sugar or glucose. Okay, and they use that as an energy source to build the rest of their body, the plant body, and then we either eat plants or we eat animals that eat plants, and so the carbon from them gets passed on to us. So if it weren't for plants, carbon dioxide would be useless to everybody else, and we wouldn't have anything to build our bodies out of. So basically, carbon dioxide is where all the carbon comes to make all these organic compounds that we'll talk about later. So inorganic compounds can be very important to organic things, but they're not considered organic, even though this one does contain carbon. Since it contains carbon, isn't that organic? But in this case, that's about the one exception. But this is where all the carbon comes from to make organic things. All right. Now, so we know if we just make basically the opposite of all the things we said about inorganic, it's the same things. The opposite things are going to be true of organic. Okay. They do contain carbon. Okay, so all of those have carbon, and so organic, anything that has carbon in it, is considered organic. All right, they tend to be very complex. Okay, very long chains and maybe thousands of atoms, rings, and other structures that they do, and their shape can even be very important. They have specific, some of them have very specific shapes. If they're not the right shape, they won't work properly, or they'll become a different chemical even. And so they're very, very kind of complicated there. All right. All right, so let's start with hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are the simplest organic compounds, and they can be almost a whole field of study by themselves. So we're not going to obviously cover everything, but we want to talk about some of this. Hydro obviously means it has hydrogen. So these are things that not only contain carbon, but hydrogen. And these two elements alone are going to make up 90% or even 99% of the atoms in these elements. Okay, some are 100% just carbon and hydrogen. Okay, so these are hydrocarbons. You may hear people talk about hydrocarbons fuels. Okay, now a couple things to talk about then before we do that. Let's talk about carbon. Carbon can have 4 bonds. If we drew a Lewis dot thing, it would have 1 dot on each side, which means it can share an electron with each side. And most commonly, hydrogen normally has 1, and so it shares, so that the hydrogen can have 2, which makes it happy, and that adds to the carbon. Okay, another hydrogen joins on here, and it can have another hydrogen joins on here, and another hydrogen joins on here. The carbon sharing all these can have 8 electrons, which is what it wants, and hydrogen, being that one of the very smaller things, only has that first level of electrons, or valence electrons, and it has access to 2, and so that makes it happy. Okay, and this would be the simplest hydrocarbon. You could have 1 carbon with 4 hydrogens attached to it. Now, when you have these 2 electrons that each of them are sharing, we usually just represent that as a line and call it a bond. Okay, and so we say there's a covalent bond between carbon and hydrogen, covalent bond here, covalent bond here, and a covalent bond here. And this would be the same thing as what you see over here. It's just instead of the dots, we're showing that they're bound by these electrons that they're sharing. And that would be the simplest hydrocarbon, which is methane. Okay, now if you had 2, you would have the same thing, except that now the carbons are joined to each other, so they can only have room for 3 hydrogens. So each carbon can bind to 4 things. Okay, in this case, they're binding to each other. That's 1, and then 3 hydrogens on each side. Another way to write this, sometimes you might say CH3 is joined to CH3, but this is what it would actually look like. Okay, now these can be named based on how many of these carbons they have in their chain. All right, if we bring down the chart here, maybe try to do here. Okay, bring down a chart. Maybe not. Okay. There are the letters. Okay, if you look at this, you've got 1 carbon with 4 hydrogens. That's called methane. Okay. If it has 2 carbons, it's called ethane. Okay, 3 is propane. You've heard of that. Okay, bottled propane gas. Butane. okay, pentane, all right, and so forth. If there's 5, 6 would be hexane, and now they start being noticed. You notice that starting here, pentane, pent means 5, hex means 6, hepta means 7, octa means 8, nona means 9, and 10 would be deca, like a decade. All right, and so they're named by how many carbons they have on their longest chain. Okay. And methane is just natural gas. So these are all, some of these are things you recognize just by their name here. Okay, now they can also be stuck on to other things, and they might be called methyl, like methyl alcohol or ethyl alcohol or so forth. Propyl, isopropyl alcohol is rubbing alcohol and so forth. So you'll recognize some of these names for that, okay, because we do use a lot of these different things. Now, one thing that makes organic different is if we had, say, hydrochloric acid, we said like before, you would have one hydrogen and one chlorine, and it doesn't really matter if the chlorine's on, if you had a chlorine and a hydrogen here, it doesn't matter. They're still one hydrogen, one chlorine, they're the same element. But if you look at some of these examples here, here your carbons go, you have 4 carbons and you have hydrogen stuck on them, okay? I'm sorry, you had 5, sorry. That's why I don't teach math. 5 carbons with all the hydrogen stuck on them. Here you have 4 hydrogens, and then this one branches off another one, but still has 5 carbons, and it still has 12 hydrogens. Okay. In this case, now you've got 1 carbon in the middle with a carbon coming off each side, and then they have carbons. It's still got 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens. So these are 3 completely different chemicals with completely different properties and actions and stuff that they would do. Okay, and because they're rearranged differently, they are completely different. And these are what we call isomers, okay, or structural isomers, because just depending on how they are arranged, they can have the same number of atoms of each element and be completely different chemicals. Whereas if you have 1 hydrogen and 1 chlorine, it's always going to be hydrochloric acid, and it's going to have those properties. But this is why organics, once again, are more complicated, because they can be arranged a lot of different ways. All right. Now, since you have all these hydrogens, it gets kind of complicated after a while to write all those H's and stuff and C's and H's. So say we did this one, we could just put the C's in place, okay? And we would just assume that the ones on the end would have 3 hydrogens to finish it off, like so, but we're not going to write them down. We just put a skeleton of it. Or sometimes we do it even simpler, and we just do it like this. Okay, and at the end of line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whoops, sorry, got one line too many there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At the end of each line, there's a carbon and the hydrogen stuck to it. Okay, and so you may see that at some time. All right. Now, another way that they can rearrange themselves, a lot of times these hydrocarbons will circle around on themselves. So you have a carbon, and it's attached to another carbon, it's attached to another carbon, to another carbon, and another carbon, and this carbon, and then this carbon will go back and hook to the first one. So a lot of times they form what we call ring structures. Okay, and so we will just draw that like this. Okay, and so you'll see these kind of honeycomb looking things, and if there's another one, then it might be attached to this, and it is very much like a honeycomb is built. You'll just see like 20 or 30 of these put together for some of these big organic compounds, okay? But just if you see those rings, you know that's some kind of organic, and there would be a carbon at each of these, and there would be hydrogen stuck off of each of these to make 4 total, and so forth, just like the other ones. Some of common, there are several. Benzene was the first one they discovered like this, so these are called benzene rings because of that. Toluene is another one found in paint thinner, airplane glues. A lot of times you smell those fumes coming off. These were the ones that people would get high on and do bad things to their brain. They're made out of these rings, okay? Now, another thing is carbon can be, usually we have what we call a single bond, carbon in the next atom. They can have 2 bonds to each other, and that would only give them 2 bonds left, so they could each have 1 hydrogen for a total of 4. And these are called double bonds. All right, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And they can even have triple bonds, which means then they would only have one hydrogen sticking off of each end. All right, and we'll talk more about what that means, but saturated versus unsaturated in our next video.